In my research, I also came across a couple of interesting lies. In The Camera Never Blinks, which is Dan Rather's rather self-promoting biography. Of course, I guess what biography isn't self-promoting? But he wrote that he never heard shots from the grassy knoll. And as a matter of fact, his job was to collect up the footage that CBS had taken of the whole event and deliver it to local TV affiliates so they could pump it back to NCR to CBS headquarters. But then 50 years later, during an anniversary CNN special, they had this really bizarre segment where they tried to recreate what happened in Dealey Plaza in real time. So you get this really interesting running commentary. You've got Rather saying, I saw some police run up this grass. I thought they're chasing the gunman. I run with them. Then you get this unidentified male. He sounds like he's a TV reporter. He says, they report here that the attempted assassin, we now hear it was a man and a woman. Then we get back to Rather. He says, they got to the top, looked around. A policeman went over the fence, so I went over the fence too. So, Dan's right there, right on top of the situation. And of course he says, there was nothing there. Well, of course not, Dan. You weren't even in Dealey Plaza. Another interesting lie, and this one's been documented by many people. Bill O'Reilly, of course, was too young to report on the Kennedy assassination. But he claims in his pro-war book, Killing Kennedy, that it was his knock on the door. He had an interview scheduled, supposedly with George the Marischal. It was his knock on the door that caused him to commit suicide. So O'Reilly knocked, and then here's a gunshot, okay? Well, we find out later from Gaten Fonzie's office, of course he was the head of the HSCA investigation, that O'Reilly had actually phoned their office that very same day from his office in Dallas, some 1,200 miles away. So O'Reilly wasn't anywhere near George Marischal's home at the time. One of the points I make in my book is that the media not only, I think, has been biased in favor of the Warren Report, they've actually been complicit in the cover-up. And I can't take credit for this research. There's a couple of reporters for the Rolling Stone who uncovered these facts. But first of all, we have Time Life purchased exclusive rights to the Zapruder film. They were the first on the scene, offered the guy $150,000, which of course we know nowadays is nothing. But then once they got the film, they withheld it from public view for 12 years while reproducing really only selected frames that eliminated any conflict with the Warren Report. And of course, they never showed us the horrible image of JFK getting the top of his head blown off. Why? Well, because it shows his head jerking backwards, which would indicate that there was actually a shot from the front and not from the rear. Days after the assassination, the Washington Post was pressured to kill an editorial they had lined up ready to run, calling for an independent investigation free of FBI, CIA, and other government influence. Of course, we know that never happened. Very interesting, Life did a major coverage story in October 1964 on the Warren Report, written by Gerald Ford, who of course was a former commission member. But what's really interesting, after this magazine hit the stand, it was recalled and then replayed it. And I don't know how many people in your audience know how expensive that is. That would probably cost Time Life hundreds of thousands of dollars. But they basically replayed it because there was evidence in the article that appeared to contradict the Warren Report. I always wondered, who paid for this hundreds of thousands of dollars for that replaying? I suspect it was the CIA. The New York Times published a book about the assassination called The Witnesses, based on testimony for the Warren Report. It very conveniently left out any testimony at all from the 40 witnesses who said they heard shots or saw smoke from behind the grassy knoll. Then you got a 1967 CBS documentary on the assassination that we know was secretly reviewed and maybe even altered by former Warren Commission member John McCloy, whose daughter just so happened to be the administrative assistant to CBS News President Richard Salon. The incredible inbredness of all this is pretty amazing. Let's go to the next slide. Why is there so much complicity? Well, we think Carl Bernstein in the late 1970s got a hold of the CIA documents showing that 400, at least 400 of the nation's top journalists were working for the CIA during the Cold War well into the 1970s. And of course, this was primarily among the Eastern elite media, the New York Times, Washington Post, CBS, and Time. And they were recruited under a top secret program, of course, known as Operation Mockingbird. What's a little bit of background that's kind of interesting is Mockingbird was headed by Cord Meyer, CIA agent, whose ex-wife, Mary Meyer, was a favorite mistress of JFK at the time of his assassination. Meyer kept a very detailed diary of her affair with JFK. Some people, Peter Janney, who wrote a book about it, thinks that she was very influential in bringing him around a more peaceful tone toward the Soviet Union. But anyway, Meyer was murdered on a secluded towpath along the Georgetown Canal. I actually went and visited the site to see exactly where it was. It could not be seen from the street. Her murderer was never found, nor her diary. And this was what's really interesting. Her diary was confiscated by CIA counterintelligence chief James Angleton, who, as we will see, played a major role in all this stuff. He broke into her apartment with the help of Ben Bradley, who happened to be Mary's brother-in-law, and at that time was editor of Newsweek. Now, this all comes from Peter Janney, whose excellent book, Mary's Mosaic. He basically had to turn to an alternative publisher to get this published. And of course, it was totally ignored by the mainstream media, but an excellent book, Mary's Mosaic. We also know now from revealed documents that the U.S. reporters actually helped sabotage Jim Garrison's case. I'm going to assume that we all know that Garrison, the New Orleans district attorney, brought Clay Shaw to trial in 1967 on conspiracy charges because he heard numerous reports that Shaw had been seen in the company of Lee Harvey Oswald and, of course, David Ferry, a known CIA gunrunner, in the months leading up to the assassination. Anyway, Life staff member Tom Bethel was assigned to work with Garrison in what Garrison believed would be a friendly story. Bethel, however, handed over Garrison's trial strategy, his list of witnesses, and their expected testimony to Shaw's defense team. Newsweek reporter Hugh Ainsworth, who, by the way, tried several times to apply to the CIA and tried to become an agent. I don't know why he was turned down. But he fed the same inside intelligence to the intelligence unit of the Dallas Police Department. And as we all know, before the trial, nearly all of Garrison's key witnesses fled to other states, including my state of Ohio, where the governors refused to extradite them. So without any key witnesses, and of course we know, we'll talk about David Ferry here in a second, but Shaw was acquitted just in a matter of hours. I mean, Garrison really didn't have anything left to stand on. Let's go to the next slide.
Okay.
Let's do it. Okay, so follow the money. We all know, anybody in journalism knows, that this has been a long-time victim in investigative journalism. Follow the money and you can find the cause or explanation for anything that happens. Garrison was the first and only U.S. investigator to look at possible funding sources for the assassination. And of course he targeted Clay Shaw. He was a New Orleans businessman. He also sat on the board of CMC Permindex. I'm sure this is terrible. This is typical American. How does Michelle pronounce his name? Is it Mikel?
Yes.
Metta?
Metta. Yeah.
Okay, am I pronouncing right, Mikel?
Well, we think so. We're not Italian, so we're not. It's Michele.
Okay, well, I'm not either. I'm trying to. Okay. Anyway, you'll get a lot more, maybe I've already gotten a lot more from Mikkel about CMC Permindex because he, of course, got a hold of the company. But we all know that it was a shadowy international trade promotion group that has been proven that it financed right-wing terrorism and assassination efforts in Europe. Garrison, of course, knew that Shaw had frequently been seen in company of Oswald and CIA-backed anti-Cuban activists, including David Ferry. Ferry, of course, denied that he knew Oswald, but he had, in fact, had trained him as a pilot in the Civil Air Patrol. And Ferry was famous for doing all these high-risk flights to Cuba because he was running guns to the rebels trying to overthrow Castro. But anyway, Ferry was Garrison's original target, but he very conveniently died of a brain hemorrhage just hours before being arrested. So I guess the bottom line here is not a single U.S. journalist ever looked into CMC Permindex, contradicting this whole belief that you follow the money. Next slide, please.
Okay.
Just a quick comparison of foreign versus domestic media coverage. And I, of course, being language challenged, foreign language challenged, only looked at the English language foreign newspapers. But what I found was really interesting looking at reviews of Oliver Stone's JFK. Among the top U.S. newspapers, there was 1 positive review against 5 negative. If you look at the major foreign English language newspapers, primarily in Australia, Canada, and England, there were 9 positive reviews versus 3 negative. And then, of course, Mikkel, we now know, is an Italian journalist, and is really the first journalist to take a closer look at CMC Permindex. I'm going to go through this quickly, but my approach to history is really based on the advice of a U.S. historian named David Hackett Fisher. But he basically says that we'll never know all the details, all the facts in any episode in history. But he's saying to fill in these gaps, we really have to rely on a preference for what he calls parsimony and consequences, but not causes. Causes always have antecedents, and we can rank their relative significance, but the important thing is, he says, is we can't isolate any one particular cause for complex events. We have to look at the big picture. So bottom line is, we see history as proceeding instead from multiple causes and their intersections, which is what I tried to do in my book. Let's go into the next slide.
Okay.
I hope I'm not preaching to the choir here, but once again, let's run down all the possible suspects, or at least that have been brought out in various conspiracy theories as to who was responsible for killing JFK. And of course, we know the strength of any suspect is measured by 3 factors: motive, means, and opportunity. JFK, and I got into a huge argument with someone on my dissertation committee who argued that every U.S. president creates powerful and potentially violent enemies. But I think JFK is in a special category. You got to look at all the people that he and his brother Robert alienated. First of all, organized crime, because of Robert's crackdown on the National Crime Syndicate. And of course, you had the CIA or rogue elements within the agency for his vow to rein in its covert operations after the disaster of the Bay of Pigs fiasco, which was sort of handed to him the first moment he stepped into the office and said, "Hey, we're going to invade Cuba. You come along with this." There was also elements of the CIA and anti-Castro Cubans because he refused air support to the Bay of Pigs invasion, and they blamed him for the fact that it is why it failed. He also promised, of course, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, when we nearly came to the brink of World War III, he promised Khrushchev he would never again try to invade Cuba. Of course, we have the USA Mafia, the Marseille Mob, and the South Vietnamese government because he cracked down once again on organized crime and the U.S. heroin trade and the assassination of South Vietnamese President Diem, which we now know Kennedy at least had some knowledge that that was happening. We also have right-wing oil interests, in particular Texas oil baron H.L. Hunt, once again because of Kennedy's efforts to reach out to the Soviet Union, and also because of his plans to eliminate the oil depletion allowance. And then we have the French secret army, the OAS, as well as Israel. They were close partners for supporting de Gaulle's moves to withdraw from Algeria, and of course grant independence and make it an Arab-controlled nation. One last slide on this, and I know I'm going into a lot of detail. Other JFK conferences I've gone to in this country, they always want to blame the military-industrial complex, which I know may have been a factor. And of course, you know, his whole peace overtures, disarmament, his willingness to disarm, and the whole nuclear proliferation agreements with Khrushchev, and for his intentions to wind down the war in Vietnam. There's a lot of controversy about whether JFK would have actually done that. Personally, I don't think he would have changed the course of the war in Vietnam, but that's just my personal opinion. LBJ has been, of late, a very popular suspect because of his plans, JFK's plans. He obviously was going to replace him as the VP nominee in the 1964 election. They hated each other. And then, of course, Robert is known to have leaked information to Life magazine about LBJ's involvement in the whole Bobby Baker congressional bribery scandal. So there was no love lost there. My personal feeling, though, looking at all the documents and what people who were closest to LBJ saw at the time of the assassination, he was scared to death, and he thought they were coming for him next. Unless, you know, he's an Oscar-winning actor, I don't think LBJ was involved in the plot. Then, of course, you have Israel and the supporters within the CIA and OAS because of JFK's very staunch opposition to Israel's development of nuclear weapons, his insistence on detailed inspections of their nuclear facilities, and he was also making overtures at the time to Egyptian President Nasser, who was, of course, a pan-Arabist and very, very close to the Soviet Union. I'm winding up here, I'm sorry. Now, of course, we know that thanks to Mikel, that the Italian fascists were involved, and because of JFK supporting the Christian Democratic Party's overtures to include socialists and communists in the coalition government there. And then last but not least, bottom line in all this is you have the CIA, right-wing elements in the U.S. and Italy, the French OAS and Israel, all shared a very deep fear of Kennedy's overtures toward the Soviet Union, which of course he made in the wake of the Cuban Missile Crisis. As an academic, I had to have some sort of theory to explain my findings. If you want to go to this next slide, Stuart.
Yeah.
You know, why is the mainstream media? They're still very wedded to the Warren Report and stubbornly opposed alternative theories. I turned to two of my favorite authors, Human and Chomsky, and of course the pivotal book, Manufacturing Consent, in which they say, bottom line, the media serve and propagandize on behalf of the powerful societal interests that control and finance them. Now, of course, he's saying these are not sledgehammer tactics. There's no overt censorship. But what goes on are these subtle pressures through selecting reporters, promoting them. They're, of course, having the right thinking about news priorities and story selection. And, of course, most important of all, deference to government and institutionalized sources. The Warren Report, of course, was composed of, at that time, probably the most respected public servants in America. How could we dare doubt anything that they wrote or concluded? Another point that they also make, of course, is the powers that be also exert outside pressure through flack. And this is becoming even truer nowadays in terms of social media. But, talking about complaints to publishers, letters to the editors, story comments, and posts to social media. Next slide, please.
Okay.
You know, as a reporter, and as in my end of my career as an investigative reporter, if somebody told me you can't go there, that is an automatic red flag to me that I gotta go there. So one suspect ignored entirely by the media and most alternative theorists in this whole conspiracy is Israel and the Mossad. We all know now, and actually thanks to Seymour Hersh's book, that JFK was adamantly opposed to Israel's nuclear development at a time when Israel felt its very existence was threatened by both Nasser and the Soviet Union. Right. We also have learned that LBJ was the first U.S. president to supply offensive arms to Israel. Now, JFK did give them defensive arms, refused to supply them with defensive. We also know that LBJ turned a blind eye to Israel's nuclear development. You can't go there without being labeled anti-Semitic. And of course, I would argue that Israel's Mossad and its right-wing leaders in the Likud party are not representative of all or even most Jews. And pro-Israeli censorship in the United States is the 10-ton gorilla that nobody wants to speak about. I'm going to just briefly, and maybe I'll cut this out. How am I doing on time?
You're doing well, Jim. Don't worry about it. You carry on.
Okay, let's go to the next slide. I'm going to talk a little bit about Michel's new evidence from CMC Permindex. Of course, I guess you all know he was able to get a hold of the company papers. But what he found is that both the CIA and right-wing Italians were alarmed that the Italian people were open to socialists and communists after the war. What's really interesting is I traveled in Italy in 1976 and stayed with a lovely Italian family outside of Milano, and they were communists. And it was really fascinating, you know, for a young kid from America. You go around their apartment, there was a crucifix in every room of the house, but they were communists. And they took me on a pilgrimage to the site in Brescia where they lived, where the right-wing terrorists had set off a bomb. I think it killed like 100 people. And this was like just a few years after it happened. But I remember how deeply moved and upset they were about this. So Michel's research really hit a chord with me. The CIA propped up the Christian Democratic Party for years. We now have documentation for that, and as long, of course, as they excluded socialists and communists. That was the whole idea, is keep those folks out. Michel came across a statement from an Italian Freemason in one of the investigations into the group, and this is from a guy named Guido Giannulli, and he's saying, neither do our American friends are happy with this leftist direction of the Italian government. Neither do our American friends for obvious reasons, and neither do our friends in Israel who are worried about the possible repercussions that a change in the balance of forces in the Mediterranean area could have on the Arab-Israeli conflict. Next slide, please.
Okay.
We probably all know this, but Michel repeats it in his book. William Harvey, of course, is famous for having dropped 60 commandos into Cuba during the 1962 missile crisis without telling the Kennedys. And of course, when they found out, it was like, holy shit, what are you doing? So basically, CIA Chief Helms at the time basically moves Harvey into Italy, gets him out of the American theater, and that's where he began forming alliances among the Italian neo-fascists, the mobsters there, and of course CMC Permindex. Michel did a great job, I think, of following the money trail. Last, somebody's looking at the money trail and all this. There was a Freemason extremist, a member of something called D2 or DUE2, and also a mobster and money launderer by the name of Michel Sindona launched a bank called Credit Coleman, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, in 1960. He then put the bank in the hands of another neo-fascist by the name of Gian Giacomo Borghese in early 1963. Borghese, like so many of these fascists in Italy, were saved from prosecution at the end of World War II, personally by James J. Angleton, who of course was the head of the OSS in Italy during the war. And of course, he got an assist from CMC member Corrado Bonfantini. Next slide, please.
Okay.
This is something, I guess, a lot of it came from the, what Gary Hemming told JFK Lancer. But basically, he said that Trujillo, of course, you know, I forget what he was the dictator from the Dominican Republic, if I recall. But anyway, he deposited 10 billion lira into Borghese's credit card, which mysteriously disappeared when Trujillo went on a mission to Haiti to organize the funds necessary to kill JFK. This comes from ex-CIA operative Gary Hemming. Hemming told JFK Lancer that a fundraising meeting was held in Port-au-Prince in February 1963, attended by all the Trujillo family members. He actually testified before the House and subcommittee on assassinations that money gathered from Canada and Europe was then sent to Dallas to finance a French team of assassins. And Metta, of course, tells us that Bloomfield also made a large money transfer from Permindex at about this time. Now, I haven't talked to Mikhail about his documentation for this, but I assume he does have some. Let's go to the next slide, please.
Okay.
So why Haiti in all this? Well, we know for a fact that the CIA had a base in Haiti for harassing Cuba in the early 1960s, and it was operated by Herbert Itkin. He partnered with Pierre Talenti and Mario Brogue, who was another Anglican recruit who helped debrief KGB deserter Anatoly Golitsyn in 1962. Angleton was absolutely obsessed with Golitsyn. We all know that he kept him isolated in prison. I don't know, he interrogated him for months and months and months because he was convinced, of course, that he was the key to uncovering all kinds of moles in the American government. Garrison argued that the plot against Castro had morphed into a mission to kill JFK, and he was probably right, concealing one plot within another. Next slide, please.
Yep.
Mikhail gets in all these interconnections between Israel-CMC, the French OAS, and the CIA. Let's go through some of them. First of all, we know, and a lot of people have known, that the Permindex board member and founder was Louis M. Bloomfield. He was an early organizer of Jewish terrorists in Palestine, a CIA contract worker, and of course the lawyer for the wealthy Brownson family of bourbon fame in Canada. I should say bourbon and bootlegging fame. Bloomfield also held half the stock in Permindex for unnamed investors. And this is according to Maurice Phillips, who is a researcher, Canadian researcher in Montreal. He says that there is a dense and long correspondence between CIA agent George H.W. Bush and Bloomfield in the Library and Archives Canada. Bloomfield's widow, of course, has blocked access to those archives. Another Permindex board member was Doug Began. He was a British spy and secretary of the National Committee for Labor Israel. Former CIA agent Philip Agee accused MTLI of conniving with the CIA. And then last but not least, we had Permindex board member George Mendel, also known as Giorgio Mentella. He changed his name when he moved to Italy. But he was famous for having removed Jews from Nazi persecution to Palestine, but only if they paid him. And then a 1959 CIA memo says witness identified Mantello as an Israeli spy. He is another Permindex board member. Let's go to the next slide.
Okay.
Some other interesting Israeli-Italian connections that Mikhail uncovered. There were many Israelis who volunteered in 1945 for ISIS, This was one of these secret armies that was organized by probably the CIA and Italian intelligence to maintain the independence of Sicily. The idea was that if Italy went communist, Sicily would at least be a bulwark against communism, and then they could launch, efforts to defeat communism in Italy if they took over there. In return for this, Israel called on John Borghese, Nino Budazzoni, and other Italian fascists to train soldiers to defeat Egypt in 1947. And Borghese and Budazzoni, as Mikhail points out, were both allies of Angleton. Let's move to the next slide, please. We also have a very close CIA French connection. This is probably familiar to a lot of people. We have Philippe de Bosch-Joly, I can't pronounce French, who was a member of French intelligence, was very close to Angleton, Bissell, Helms, all the folks at the CIA. Jean Suetra, I can't pronounce it. He had many aliases. He was the famed OAS assassin. He helped recruit Bosch-Joly to the CIA. And we know that Suetra was involved in the assassination of Congolese Prime Minister and socialist Patrice Lumumba in 1961. 2 years later, and this is really interesting, Suetra shows up in Houston and Dali. He shows up in Houston the morning that JFK arrives, and then later that afternoon goes to Dallas when Kennedy also goes to Dallas as well. This has been documented, and it's really interesting because it came from a heavily redacted CIA document that Mary Farrell, who is a legendary JFK researcher in the United States, she decided she was going to use some crude sort of chemical methods to see if she could see behind the redaction, and this is what she found. Basically, the French intelligence officials saying, hey, did you know that this guy was in your country at the same time? And also, we would like to know what happened to him because we have de Gaulle is about to visit Mexico in a few days, and we want to know where this guy is. It's all in a CIA document. Of course, the CIA never followed up on that. Or, I'm sorry, the FBI. Then, of course, you have the Israeli, French, and Italian connection. Italian secret agent and OAS collaborator Guido Giannatini testified that the Israelis wanted French domination of Algeria, once again the counter-Arab influence in the Middle East. French OAS leader Jacques Cousteau had been a governor in the Algerian colony, and of course became a sworn enemy of de Gaulle after his decision to withdraw. He also was a sympathizer with Israel. And then Mikhail also found a series of stories in the magazine Israel detailing the very real fears among Israelis in Algeria that they would be exterminated if Algeria was given its independence. So you can see why the Israelis and the French would really hang together over this whole issue of Algeria. Let's move to the next slide.
Okay.
What is the bottom line and common thread in all of this? No surprise, James J. Angleton. His ties, of course, to Italy and France and all these neo-fascists in Israel goes back to the OSS and early intelligence circles during and immediately after World War II. Going forward, of course, he became head of counterintelligence for the CIA. He was so secretive that he even had his own form of internal communication within the agency that no one else was privy to. The guy was just incredible. And he was also the liaison to Israel's Mossad well into the mid-1970s. Angleton was finally moved in 1974. We can thank New York Times investigative reporter Seymour Hersh because he exposed the CIA operation to spy on and infiltrate the U.S. anti-Vietnam War movement. And I don't know if you're familiar with U.S. law, but the CIA is not allowed to do domestic surveillance. That is against the law. It's entirely the bailiwick of the FBI. Let's move to the next slide, please.
Yeah.
Final slide, so I haven't racing through this. There's just no question now, and especially with McKell's research, that this was an international conspiracy. And it needs an international effort to document it once and for all. And, look what McKell was able to accomplish working alone in Italy. What if we had researchers, journalists collaborating in France, Israel, Mexico, Cuba, Haiti, Russia, all these other countries, how much information we could put together on all this. There's already a role model for these kind of collaborative efforts. There's something now known as the International Consortium of Investigative Reporters. I won't take you to that website there, but they, of course, are the people who got a hold of all of the 11.5 million documents that were leaked, known as the Panama Papers. They analyzed those in a matter of months and produced a series of stories. Anyway, I was delighted to find out that this organization has not disbanded. It still exists, and they're still doing fine investigative work. They recently won the top prize from the Scripps Howard Foundation with the series they did on defective medical implants. They took a global look at how these companies that are making these implants are not testing them, and of course are basically bribing surgeons and doctors to use them, and they're having all kinds of problems with patients who have been subjected to these things. Anyway, that wraps it up for me. I'm entirely open to questions.
That's brilliant, Jim. Thank you very much. I have a first question. You've obviously done some research into media abroad, not just in the USA. One of the things we feel in this country, we see a lot of JFK programs that come out, particularly at anniversaries and so on. And we do feel that the British Broadcasting Company, the BBC, is very much biased towards Warren Committee results rather than the independent channels. And I often wonder whether the BBC is influenced somehow through the American government or through our government. It is very apparent to me and to friends of mine that the BBC tends to be pro-Warren, and the other independent channels are very much conspiracy theorists.
Mm-hmm. Well, there may be that, but I'm convinced that you really don't need anything that formal or organized. There's something about working for the mainstream media. I mean, I think they're just automatically more deferent to government and government officials. And at least in the United States, if you're among those sort of elite media circles, you are constantly in contact with these people. To quote what was C. Wright Mills, who long ago wrote the book about the power elite in the 1950s, 1960s, these people are all known to each other. They party together, they socialize together, and there's just a natural deference to them. I think this may also extend to the BBC. I mean, they do get government funding, right? I mean, that's and I'm not saying that the government officially or overtly influences their thinking, but that's got to be there. And as Herman and Chomsky has said, it's not like these reporters are being overtly or covertly pressured. It's just they hire and promote people who have this sort of natural deference to authority. Yeah. And I think that's what you're seeing. Yeah. My Bible, I subscribe to the Guardian. The BBC, I hardly look at it, but I really love the work that they're doing at the Guardian.
Yes. Yeah. Any other questions, Bill?
Yeah, I've got a whole load.
So have I.
Can you hear that, Jim, from the back?
I think you're going to have to repeat it for me, Stuart.
Okay, yeah, Bill, what's your question?
Yeah, my first one is, it's a comment actually, because I was in the old militant tendency in the Labour Party in the 1970s, in which we were trying to, in effect, take over the Labour Party. But, and I discovered that the press openly tells lies. They were openly telling lies about us, things that they knew were lies when they were repeating. I mean, so anything that is anti-establishment, the press will pervert or lie about. The second point is the second point is who owns the media, and in my understanding is that they're owned. That most of the mainstream press and the TV companies are owned by 6 huge media corporations, 6 global media corporations, one of which of course is the Merta corporation. They of course are the establishment's PR department in effect. The next effort comes back to what Jim was saying about his student who actually was complaining, well, all presidents create enemies. Yes, they do, and some presidents create enough enemies to be murdered. And I go back to Zachary Taylor in 1850. Well, there are certain parallels with Kennedy and Zachary Taylor. Zachary Taylor was an American war hero who was put into the presidency to represent the interests of the southern states. He was a Louisiana slaveholder in the same way that Kennedy came from a family of extremely rich people. But Taylor ended up by renegading on southern interests. I believe he supported the famous Missouri Compromise, much to the South's disgust. And then on July the 4th, 1850, after a White House garden party, he was suddenly taken ill and died. And it was claimed at the time that he died of food poisoning. But all the symptoms were symptoms of arsenic poisoning, and when his body was interred disinterred many years later, arsenic was found in his hair. Ditto, Warren G. Harding, whose administration was riddled with corruption. Warren G. Harding suddenly died, apparently in perfect health, apart from a very slight cold, and then suddenly he drops dead. There has never been an autopsy on Warren G. Harding, so nobody knows what killed him or how he came to die. There's just 2 presidents who also died under very mysterious circumstances. 2 people. There were reasons for, as with Kennedy, of people wanting them out the way.
What's your question? I think
no, I'm making comments as well to support, in effect, supporting Jim and what he's saying. My next one, Garrison, the Tsar, the CIA, the defector Garrison. My understanding is that Garrison also claimed to be the son of the late Tsar, the one who apparently was a haemophiliac, and that he claimed to have made some sort of miraculous recovery from haemophilia. In fact, it's quite clear that the guy was a nutcase. My next little question is Angleton. My next comment is Angleton. Angleton actually hero worshipped Kim Philby, who was then found to be a British traitor working for the Russians. Angleton should really have been removed a lot earlier than he was. And my final effort is about the book Mary's Mosaic. I tried getting it through Foyles earlier this year. Unfortunately, I couldn't get it, and I will be trying to get Jim's book See No Evil from the same company.
Thanks, Bill.
Did you hear that, Jim?
No, I didn't. You're going to have to try to summarize for me. Sure.
Yeah, I think that there were comments really from one of our very informed delegates, Bill Beadle, and he was commenting on your presentation and adding some of the points that he was making back into the previous century. So it was very difficult to get a question out of it. But any other questions?
Yeah, can Jim hear me?
Can you hear that? Can you hear that?
Well, I'm a little hearing challenged to begin with.
Okay. Far.
Just a few questions, and do you know when Clayshaw joined Permindex?
Sorry, what was that?
Do you know when Clayshaw joined Permindex?
Well, I think Mikkel is a better source on that, but I'm pretty sure it was 1960 or 1961. And what's interesting is he was listed as a member in Who's Who up until the time that he was taken to court by Jim Garrison, and suddenly that was eliminated from his Who's Who profile.
Okay, next question. Are you aware, this goes from another book, not Michaeli's book, but talks about SDECE officer by the name of Delanium. Yeah. That he was with Angleton on the 22nd of November 63 in Washington. Does Jim have any thoughts on that?
I think Jim's finding it difficult to hear, to be honest with you.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, no problem.
Did you say someone by the name of Deloria? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
You'll have to come up, I think.
Yeah.
When you ask a question.
What?
Will you do that?
Yeah, I can't pick up on all the questions. We've got one more question coming now, Jim. Yeah.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, your name Jim?
Yeah, hi.
Hi. Last question. It is mentioned very early on in Metta's book about Bloomfield being the founder and being a shareholder of Permindex.
Right.
What evidence is there of that?
Well, I mean, you have to ask Michaela, but I think that's been pretty well documented, even prior to his research. I know I've read several sources on it. There had been some stories, even in the mainstream media, about Permindex, mostly, about what a great thing it was in terms of promoting international trade. There's also the famous article in the Italian newspaper, am I pronouncing it right? Pesa Sera, which was a left-leaning Italian paper, but they were the first really to expose what was going on with them. The CIA later, of course, tried to disparage that by saying it was basically a Soviet front and it was Soviet disinformation. But that's of course, the CIA would obviously say that.
Yeah.
But as far as I know, that Italian newspaper article was the very first to expose what was going on with Permindex. And you'd have to ask Michaela about what other evidence she has.
Okay, it's just that the Canadian Library, I believe, have now released all of Bloomfield's stuff. And there was some that they held back, but not for nefarious reasons, but simply because Bloomfield was a lawyer, and therefore there was client privilege, you know, to hold back some papers. But there's nothing in there and in his letters that indicate that he's was associated with Permindex or CMC, other than working for clients.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, you know, I think the expert on that would be Maurice Phillips. You know, of course, who's the researcher in Montreal, and
Yeah.
I don't know what he would say. I'm not sure what he would say in response to that. I am not really an expert. I do know that Maurice maintains his own website on the JFK assassination and the Bloomfield papers. And as far as I know, not all of them have been released. And as you say, whether or not they're relevant to Permindex, I don't know the answer to that either.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Jim.
Yeah, thank you for your comments, sir.
Jim, thanks a lot. So it's Tony Power here, just taking over. We got one more, and we promise it's a very short question. Do you want to just come down, and then we'll make this the last question. Thank you. Thanks for your patience, Jim.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hello, Jim. Thank you for your contribution this afternoon. I just want to address one minor point you raised. The BBC have something of a bad press from you. I worked for a number of years at the BBC, and during all of my time there, individually, personally, I was never subject to any editorial pressure, nor were any of my colleagues in the newsroom. And I think we need to be absolutely clear that the BBC staff and governors guard their independence from government very, very seriously.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to raise that point.
No, and
Okay.
no, and I'm glad you brought that up, and I agree. Another point I wanted to make, I mean, I've spent this whole lecture talks of disparaging journalists, especially American journalists. But a lot of them have been involved in the JF investigation and have done excellent work. The only problem is that in order to do that work, they've had to leave behind their jobs at the mainstream media. I mean, I can go down the list. Jefferson Morley was with the Washington Post. He left to become a JFK investigator. Jim Mars, early on, left the Dallas Times-Herald to write his book on the conspiracy. Anthony Summers, and correct me if I'm wrong about, wasn't he a BBC reporter at one time?
Yeah.
But he's written some books and some excellent things about the assassination. But the list goes on and on. Wes Baker, Lisa Pease, even Carl Bernstein, I think, had to drop out of the mainstream media to do true investigative journalism about the media and its relationship with the power structure. As I said before, I don't think there's overt or covert pressure on journalists. I just think it's the environment that they work in is so deferential to the authorities that it's very, very hard to write extremely critical things like saying that there was a conspiracy. There was at least some members of the U.S. government involved in a conspiracy to kill JFK. You just can't go there and still be a part of the mainstream media.
Jim, thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much for your time. It's very interesting indeed, and we might well call upon you in the future if you're willing to give us another talk. Fantastic, and thank you very much for your time. Cheers, Jim. Bye-bye now.